The Moral Dilemma Created by a Religious Canon. Reflections on how to read, how to teach, how to live. Lecture given in the Clow Library of the Hebrew Union College, Cincinnati, Ohio, by David H. Aaron, Professor of Hebrew Bible and the History of Interpretation, April 29, 2025. I'm going to argue that our relationship with canonized literature has long been morally problematic, and that no Jewish, or for that matter, Christian denomination has developed an ethics of reading. What is an ethics of reading? An ethics of reading is fundamentally a well-articulated strategy for handling moral problems in texts. An ethics of reading asks fundamental questions about authorship, the history of reception, and the role of the reader as interpreter or performer of the text. At the core of an ethics of reading is the question, what is the impact of a work of literature and the way it is treated by any given generation of readers? The concept derives from the 1950s, but it was explored prominently by J. Hillis Miller and Wayne Booth in the 1980s and 1990s regarding curricula in English departments. Martha Nussbaum expanded insightfully on many of the early discussions, especially regarding racism and misogyny in classical literature. The literary theorists were concerned with the informal canons adopted by English departments around the world. A rejection of the constraints this informal canon placed on discourse within universities was vociferously articulated by people like Paul Moses at the University of Chicago, and counter-reactions were also forthcoming by scholars such as Harold Bloom, among others. If the debate over a reader's moral responsibility as a performer of literature could be this intense regarding books by Shakespeare and Milton, Dante and Homer, Swift and Twain, books which did not shape the way people lived on a daily basis, one might have imagined that the religious canon would yield an equally heated debate. But it did not. When writing my book, Subversive Principles, I originally thought to use the subtitle Toward an Ethics of Reading a Vote, but my publisher, who releases about 300 books a year in the area of Christian and Jewish studies, felt that no one in the field would know what that means. Hence the revised title, Reflections on Avot 1 and 2. This is not to say the community of Jewish scholars is without awareness of the issues. Early feminist Judaica scholars such as Tikva Frimer-Kensky, Judith Romney-Wegner, Susan Neidich, and many, many others since the 1980s have been attuned to the problems of navigating the depiction, or lack thereof, of women in biblical and rabbinic literature. Other scholars have focused intensely on the moral implications of themes such as war and Bali politics in rabbinic literature. More than 50 years ago, Norman Gottwald discussed the oppressive class structure supported by Hebrew scriptures in a variety of works that adopted neo-Marxist theory. However, no religious denomination has embraced a commitment to the development and teaching of an ethics of reading, save for a fleeting engagement in Reconstructionism, which unfortunately waned after Mordechai Kaplan's passing. An ethics of reading is a specific kind of hermeneutic, that is, a philosophy of reading, which brings the reader directly in touch with the ethical implications of the texts they are considering. The approach always starts with what Paul Ricoeur called a hermeneutics of suspicion. That suspicion fosters a critical awareness of what is happening within a literary text, while eschewing traditional assumptions and ideological commitments. Once that hermeneutics of suspicion is fostered, the next step is to develop strategies for dealing with morally troubling aspects of our inherited canons. I am going to extend my argument about the morality of traditional canons to a consideration of large language models, commonly referred to as artificial intelligence, which in my view are amplifying the moral problems caused by canons in a number of unexpected ways. I recognize that some of the concerns I have about the representation of Judaism on the internet were pressing before the introduction of large language models. I will require a number of steps to elucidate why the morality of canon preservation is about to become more problematic than ever before in history. I will do my best to tie everything together at the end. It is very difficult to date the emergence of canon within Judaism. Today, I am not going to review the evidence on either dating or process. Rather, I will focus on the ethical implications of a community's acceptance of a canon and how those implications are particularly significant in a world increasingly engaged with large language models. Canons come into existence in two ways. The less frequent method involves a conscious design by specific authorities. This would be the case, for instance, with the Canon of the Church of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons. Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon, published in 1830, became the central canonical work of this church instantaneously. Catholic papal law entails this kind of engineered canon as well, but this is the less common phenomenon. More common is what I will call a quasi-emergent canon. Emergence is the phenomenon where complex systems that are interacting within a shared environment evoke the appearance of patterns that are not planned for, not engineered, but which just happen to come into existence by virtue of the way the discrete systems within an environment interact. That is, they emerge. Emergent properties are new features of vast complex systems that cannot in any way be anticipated or explained on the basis of the constituent parts of the interacting systems. By analogy, I am speaking of emergent canons as a cluster of books that are grouped within an array of interrelated cultural systems that ultimately foster a social convention that relates to the cluster of books as having a distinctive status. No author or redactor of any book of the Hebrew Bible knew that they were writing something that would be anthologized in a work that would be held as canonical. In fact, the idea didn't even exist when they were writing. The final stage of canonization likely involved works already well known. Some individual or group recognized how elevating some writings above others offered their positions in life certain social and political advantages. In other words, the salience of the individual books was largely a matter of emergence within a culture. But then a radical step was required to formalize the status of the collection. This required the intervention of knowing agents. These agents invariably ascribed to the importance of the books in the collection. They invariably ascribed the importance of the books in the collection to a divine edict, albeit without offering too much detail. By doing this, they aggressively exclude competing works from the sanctioned hierarchy of literature and all but guarantee the demise of other works within any given religious community. Ironically, canon is a literature killer. Because canonization is not a purely emergent phenomenon, no social phenomenon is, I prefer to think of the Hebrew Bible as a quasi-emergent cultural artifact. As noted, the initial clustering was not according to someone's program, but once it began, authoritative figures within a community recognized how they might exploit what cultural emergence has placed in their hands. The difference then between an engineered canon and a quasi-emergent canon lies in the historical process. But once the canon is formed, the continuing historical effects are identical, namely the control of what is read, what is thought, and what is believed. As such, the way a canon is formed matters little to downstream history. As my comments imply, even the formation of a canon has moral implications because it is always established on the basis of someone's very particular interest in influencing, if not outright controlling, the thought and behavior of a community. In contrast to formalized and quasi-emergent canons, we're now witnessing the appearance of a variety of canons that are fully based on principles of emergence in complex systems. We are able to watch in real time how large language models, along with various kinds of optimized search engines, are bringing a canon into existence in a variety of areas of discourse, not just religion. While all sorts of people are arguing that the internet is democratizing knowledge, I would argue that it is quite the opposite. Knowledge is being controlled and dispensed by optimization formulas that are focused on monetization and not the free flow of information. There is, of course, more access to information than ever before, but that does not in itself constitute democratization. The problem is that Westerners are especially accustomed to acquiescing to canonical systems. As such, this new emergent canon is hardly being noticed, and it will have no problem being adopted as legitimate. It is already resulting in highly regulated forms of religious and political discourse. Before I elucidate this theme further, I wish to reflect on the moral issues raised by allegiance to a canon. It would be one thing if canons were just lists of recommended books to read, but that's not how they functioned in antiquity. Canons claimed to be all that a religious adherent needed in life, but this moved beyond biblical literature in both Judaism and Christianity. Judaism had devised multiple canonical collections by the end of the classical rabbinic period, that is, by the time the Bavli was more or less closed in the 7th century. These canons, which serve as mechanisms for controlling community practices and discourse regarding everything from how to eat and pray, what to study and think, and how to understand a biblical passage, are functionally more constraining than the original canonical forms associated with lists of sanctioned literary works that resulted in the Hebrew Bible. This is because these secondary level canons functioned at the micro level of social engineering. I would suggest that the early rabbinic sages recognized the way the biblical canon imbued them with social and intellectual capital, and then emulated the canonical structure for other walks of life. There are surely people who find nothing morally objectionable in the Bible or rabbinic literature. Such people occupy a discrete speech community, as Foucault would label it. Their discourse is not one I can participate in. Except for those who adopt a fundamentalist perspective, the morally troubling aspects of our canon should be self-evident. As R. Joseph Hoffman expresses it regarding Hebrew Scriptures and New Testament, I quote now, "A book that teaches the inferiority of women, the permissibility of slavery, the ostracism of non-Jews and later non-Christians, the stoning of disobedient sons, the necessity of blood feud and vengeance, and a dozen other unsavory attitudes and rules, scarcely qualifies as an instrument of intellectual and social liberation," end quote. We might add to Hoffman's list things like a deity who manifests severe anger management problems, irresolvable tensions between collective punishment and individual innocence, the maintenance of an oligarchy that gives lip service to assisting the poor while preserving an economic hold on the cultic institutions that largely contribute to a shocking inequality even in remote antiquity, to name just a few additional systemic problems. Think about what canon formation did in antiquity and even in today's synagogue ritual. The concept that you are to read one and only one book over the course of a year, year in and year out, namely the Pentateuch, and no other literature in that liturgical slot on Monday, Thursday, and Saturday, is fundamentally about controlling narrative formation among community members. This is not without its positive sides. Surely it contributes to identity formation. What's problematic is that the community does not also teach a strategy for treating the unethical aspects of the text. That is, it does not teach or even value an ethics of reading. Similarly, the recitation of the exact same prayers, with minor adjustments for holidays and similar calendric acknowledgments, such as a new moon, constitutes the strongest possible constraint on a person's spiritual practice. Of course, the rigidity of ritualized liturgy in the pre-modern world waxed and waned depending upon where you lived, and at various points in history, religious worship was regularly augmented by newly composed piyutim. Augmentation is still practiced in synagogue communities around the world, but augmentation does not threaten the stability of the liturgical canon. I'm quite certain that people in love with the canon will never describe canon as constraining or controlling the ideas of religious adherents, but that is precisely what it is designed to make them believe. Fish swimming in a pond don't imagine swimming in a different body of water. If you were to say, wouldn't Judaism look completely different without its canon? The answer would be most certainly yes, it would be different. Is that a good or a bad thing? I suppose it matters who answers. Clearly, we no longer have animal sacrifice, so it's not as if we cannot imagine different ways of being Jewish, that is, ways that do not conform to the aspects of the canon. I am not so naive as to believe any religion will shed its canon, so there's no danger of such a thing happening, but I am concerned that denominations readily ignore the need for an ethics of reading. My goal is not to evaluate the morality of our liturgy or biblical or rabbinic literature. Others have already done this quite adeptly, and it is a central aspect of my recent book, Subversive Principles. Over the past 2 centuries, few engaged in ethical criticism as actively as Mordechai Kaplan. Kaplan cringed whenever he heard Shelo asanu k'goyei ha'aratzot, who did not make us like any other nation, and similar expressions of chosenness, such as Asher Bachar Banu, who chose us in the liturgy and biblical readings. Any form of chosenness, wrote Kaplan, I quote, always means the superiority of the chosen over the rejected. This he found morally repugnant. He implemented alternative language in each of his liturgical publications, starting with his Passover Haggadah of 1941. Unlike other religious communities, Mordechai Kaplan did assertively develop an ethics of reading, and he made his moral values evident in the liturgies he published. He explained in great depth among his voluminous writings how he believed we should read canonical works and why we should push beyond them in our religious practices. But Kaplan is really an exception to the rule. Rather than seriously pursue an ethics of reading, most religionists gravitate to 2 very bad forms of apologetics. The worst form, in my opinion, employs what can be called historical moral relativism. This is the explanation that things like slavery or misogyny or advocating for the elimination of an entire people were simply conventional components of antiquity, which we now simply sidestep and excuse because we are at a different stage of civilization's development. Maimonides actually engaged a version of this approach in the Guide for the Perplexed. In a sense, a community will select for the ethical elements in the canon that match up with their own moral sensibilities and offer this relativistic disclaimer for the objectionable components. This approach is morally unacceptable for 2 main reasons. First, as I endeavor to illustrate in Subversive Principles, we can find writings in antiquity that readily condemn the possession of humans as property, and we find authors who recognize women to be equal to men in remote antiquity. And of course, from the Iliad onward, we have numerous writings condemning the horrific character of war. Yes, only a few of these voices have survived, not because they didn't exist in greater numbers, but because the establishment worked assiduously to suppress their discontent in part in the name of canonical sanctity. The fact that some people felt it appropriate to have slaves and others did not and that some people saw women as inferior and others did not, suggests that there were cultural choices available, as was the case, of course, in antebellum America. As such, to claim that a particular convention was historically natural is to exonerate people from being responsible for their lives as moral agents. Those who perpetuate such injustices should not be allowed to hide behind the cloak of antiquity. It's just wrong to think that everyone lacked a moral compass. The second problem with this kind of historical moral relativism is that the principle of moral progress is misguided and abused. How is it that people who excuse the behaviors of ancients aren't cognizant of the rampant misogyny, the horrific exploitation of the lower classes of society still plaguing our own world, not to mention the inane justifications of war that infect our warmongering nations? Where's the progress? I do not want to get into the question of whether there has been real progress in history. I cover this question quite extensively in my book. I just wish to make clear that technological progress may look unequivocal, and even the diminishment of things like poverty and infant mortality may have shown steady improvement over the past century. But history teaches us that all moral states are tenuous at best, not absolute, and they can be reversed by a tyrant instantaneously. 100 years of diminishing racism does not guarantee continued diminishment of that evil over the coming 50 years. And even advantageous technologies like vaccines and psychological therapies can suddenly be dismissed despite seeming objectively beneficial to humanity. Progress, as Adorno would suggest, is a delusion. We are witnessing catastrophic reversals of so-called progress in the United States of America at this very moment. I will leave it to you to fill in the examples. So historical moral relativism is a very bad strategy for reading canonical literature. A somewhat different strategy was adopted in the 19th and early 20th century by Reform Judaism. This entailed the aggressive exercising of ethical and ritual practices deemed primitive, alongside aspects of synagogue decorum and traditions that were objectionable on aesthetic grounds. Unfortunately, while removing what was undesired, the community did almost nothing to educate its community the way Kaplan did as to why such exclusions should be implemented. Regarding Reform Judaism and the Canons, consider the early Union Haggadah, with origins in the 19th century but updated in 1907 and 1923. Professor Richard Saracen notes that while maintaining, quote, a strong, effective connection to the Seder ritual, there is a clear cognitive distancing from its pre-modern form and some of its content, which is either eliminated entirely or reshaped to conform to contemporary sensibilities, end quote. Passages that were deleted included the angry or vengeful references to the Gentiles, and the idea of redemption was thoroughly reframed as imminently available to the Haggadah's contemporary audience in the context of legally established political rights. Similarly, the rejection of the annual reading cycle of Torah on Shabbat and the selectivity exercised in determining scriptural passages permitted rabbis to ignore the many less palatable passages in the Torah. And finally, the religious canon represented by the traditional liturgy was radically revamped, initially through the removal of the Hebrew language from the worship experience, and also through the selective restructuring of the liturgy. In each of these instances, the Siddur liturgy, the Haggadah, and the reading of Torah, Reform Judaism imagined it was preserving a relationship to the canon while being highly selective in its usage. In effect, it created a modified canon without removing the very notion of canonicity. So perhaps there's nothing really to discuss. Perhaps Reform Judaism has been modeling an ethics of reading all along. I wish it were that simple. That is, I wish I could say that Reform Judaism has provided Jews who recognize the problem with canonical literature a working solution, only it has not. If there was a project in place, that project has failed miserably over the past 80 years or so. That's because rather than nurturing its communities with the skills to engage in an ethics of reading, Reform Judaism simply removed from sight all of those things that its leadership considered problematic. In a most ironic manner, Reform Judaism solved the problem of canon by constricting yet further how its ancient documents would be read and used in synagogue life, or as part of the educational program supported by the then Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Reform Judaism solved its distaste for outmoded religious practices not by developing an ethics of reading, but by destroying the evidence that exposed religious discontinuities. I wish to acknowledge that Alvin Reines made a moral evaluation of canonical works a central part of his teaching here at HUC. While perspicacious in many regards, I felt that his approach proved unable to contribute to the positive formation of an ethics of reading. Rather, he advocated a rampant act of removal. But that's a subject for another time. I also wish to acknowledge the remarkable work of Aharon Varieties, the founding director of the Open Siddur project, which brings together prayer resources from around the world. Obviously, both Varieties and Reines represent independent voices not sanctioned by any specific worship community. Changing the contents of one's religion by simply altering its canon instead of developing an ethics of reading leads one to replicate the canonical solution of restricting one's awareness of one's own history. When a community silently perpetuates the use of canon, it implicitly exonerates individuals from critically engaging with their literary inheritance. What is needed is a religious conviction regarding the function of critical thinking, not impenetrable processes of literary substitutions on the part of community leaders. People acculturated to a canon-bearing community are likely to find it difficult, if not impossible, to imagine that a religious community could exist without a canon. Or framed somewhat differently, a culture that is robustly formed within a canon-bearing worldview works very hard to thwart the imaginations of its adherents so as to make a religious life without canon inconceivable. This is ultimately a problem of creativity and inertia. Invoking Foucault, a community's inability to imagine an alternative way of being is never ascribed to the control exercised over thinking by conventionalism or authoritative voices. Rather, failed imagination is redefined as acquiescence to natural historical developments. If you think something is not possible, you will never entertain it as an option. That is exactly what canonically inclined communities are counting on. Edmund Jabez once wrote, "The Word of God is not commandment, but correspondence." For most people, thinking about our inherited literature not as a cluster of obligations, but as the beginning of a never-ending discourse, is truly unimaginable. I fully understand that one way to dispense with this entire discussion is to refuse to accept the authority of any canon. That is what most secularists do, who find nothing compelling in belonging to a religious community. But I am suggesting that acquiescence to canons is an underlying principle of Western civilization and not just endemic to religious communities. It is by virtue of a vast acceptance of canonicity in the areas of law and beyond, as Foucault so brilliantly elucidates in his theory of discourse structures, that no one, beyond a few egghead academics, seems to be alarmed by such things as Wikipedia and the forthcoming narratives produced by AI. Despite the fact that the internet makes available unbelievably vast amounts of information, the search engines, optimized to make money, end up directing the end user to an ever more narrow array of sources. This is quite clearly an emergent canon in the making. Without the development of a formalized ethics of reading, that is a highly critical approach to the content of what we are served as end users of the internet, we will remain as acquiescent to its problematic moral perspectives as we are to our traditional canons. Every time you engage a large language model, you are asking a computer to generate a narrative on the basis of a massive store of data that it has available. Recently, some of the companies offering large language models made it possible for the LLMs to access the internet. That was not possible when they were originally released. The data available to the LLM is not differentiated on the basis of validity or nuance. Rather, it is prioritized on the basis of frequency of use. On the surface, that does not sound pernicious, but in real life, we will see that this system will amplify the most nefarious aspects of Canon, which I would identify as the constraining of learning and critical thinking. I did some 50 searches and queries on large language models and search engines using Google Search, Bing, Gemini, Copilot, and Claude. I executed these queries naively. I want to emphasize this. Despite a vigorous attempt by my computer science teaching son to only use LLMs for the discrete tasks for which they were designed, I just sat down and typed questions or had conversations the way any layperson might do who is generally unaware of how these things work or why they were designed as they are. Sorry, Joshua. Before I finished a quarter of my experiments, what became unequivocally clear is that the online Jewish canon is being dominated by a single source of information, a single discourse community, and that is Chabad. I am not going to review the results of the 50 experiments, but I will highlight some of the most salient elements. I asked these systems, search engines, and LLMs to discuss a variety of subjects. In one of the first dozen searches I did, I asked how the role of women is to be understood in Judaism. Among the first 3 URLs listed, 2 were Chabad-affiliated sites, and another was written by a woman who proclaims herself, quote, a traditional observant Jew, end quote, although she quickly added that she is not an expert on Judaism. Imagine someone who places right in their opening page that they are not expert in Judaism nonetheless appears within the first 3 hits when researching Judaism and women, while a vast array of significant scholars of Judaism do not appear anywhere among the listings. This means this non-expert author is being read quite frequently, and her disclaimer has done nothing to dissuade her readership. Her discourse confirmed that she was not expert, but her quasi-orthodox perspective was expressed with intense passion and emotional appeal. Perhaps they are the source of her site's attractiveness. Her appearance so high on the list was the result of search optimizations rather than information value. The second site I visited on this theme was hosted by Chabad, which led to a linked site called thejewishwoman.org. There, a woman's article appears endeavoring to refute the concept that gender or gender roles are in any way social constructs, but must be defined on the basis of God's creation of the human being. The rather bizarre theory offered came hauntingly close to that of Otto Weininger's distorted concept that both men and women have intrinsically masculine and feminine traits, and that the balance of each person is what determines their desires. On Weininger, you can see Alan Janik and Edelston Toulmin's fabulous 1996 book, Wittgenstein's Vienna, which tells the story of this tragic, tortured soul and his suicide at the age of 23. The author on the Chabad site concludes that at the end of the day, we are either a man or a woman. Then she writes, quote, the greatest difference between a man and woman, or more appropriately between the masculine and the feminine, can be seen in the intellectual qualities of a human being. Hasidic philosophy teaches that there are 3 intellectual properties alongside 7 emotional properties. The first of the properties is that of chokhmah, translated loosely as wisdom, which is a male principle, end quote. I remind you that this was the second website to appear on my search. Much further down the list, one found an entry from the Harvard University Pluralism Project, and then an article on the nature of women in the Jewish Women's Archive, which was little more than a dry, dispassionate halachic survey with some significant conceptual problems, such as citing medieval and early modern sources that manifested no discernible influence over Jewish life even during the era in which they were written. In Claude, I asked the LLM to reflect on the presence of evil among humans. It responded, quote, "Rather than seeing people as inherently evil, I tend to focus on understanding the conditions that lead to evil actions, prejudice, fear, ideological extremism, dehumanization of others, unchecked power, and group dynamics that enable harm." I tend to focus. Who is the first person in that statement? Does the computer have a tendency in the sense that a human being does? Does it do things habitually or on the basis of conviction? Why did the computer think to start with the concept of inherent evil? Nothing in my prompt suggested that concept. Claude's list of conditions that lead to evil actions, on the surface at least, all sound legitimate. I could easily imagine a student writing such a list in a term paper. To me, the most disconcerting thing about Claude is that his discourse sounds as if it's coming from an omniscient being. Regarding every single prompt, Claude speaks with authority and confidence. One is no more inclined to question him than the assurances made by a religious community that the Torah is the word of God. Claude and God. I have a sense that the former has more awareness than the latter of what we humans want to hear. The problem is, Claude always sounds intelligent, even when he doesn't know something or when he makes things up, what computer scientists call hallucinating. When I ask Claude to summarize and contrast the evidence from Jewish and Christian sources regarding Pulselina of Blois and the 1171 blood libel suit, note, summarizing is something it generally does very well, it responded that it did not know anything about Pulselina. I know. If I had fed Claude with all of the relevant texts, it would have done the task adeptly. But that's not what I did. I just asked without assumptions. Claude paused and told me that it would access the internet to provide an answer. I asked him to cite his sources. He succeeded in writing about Pulselina on the basis of information from Chabad and Wikipedia. Mostly correct, but very incomplete. Oddly, there was an excerpt from the Jerusalem Post, which was quite strange. You see, statistical factors influenced where Claude searched. Apparently, the Hathi Trust, the world's largest database of scholarly publications, is not accessible to him, nor is HUC Press's 2 editions of Marcus and Saperstein's Jews in Medieval Christian Europe, which would have provided him with first-rate information. Still, the ever-confident Claude provided narrative that was supremely authoritative in tone. My purpose here is not to elucidate every error or every solid point produced by the LLMs I tried, and let me emphasize there were many solid responses to my queries. I also wish to make clear that LLMs are very good at certain tasks for which they were specially designed, including the summary of large documents and even the writing of tedious computer code. But I use these tools the way the common student or citizen, without any deep understanding of their functions, would use them on any given day of the week. I am suggesting that our common cultural institutions have dulled the minds of people through unquestioning acceptance of the very concept of canonization. We are acculturated to canonical practices. In effect, without an ethics of reading, each generation will look to this emergent canon as authoritative. We need to vigorously teach otherwise, both with regard to our inherited canon and with regard to what is presently emerging. Chabad, which is run by the Lubavitch Hasidic movement, has about 95,000 adherents as of 2018, and the Pew Research Center notes that 38% of American Jews have participated in some activity or other of Chabad services, whether it's sending their toddlers to day school, a Shabbat meal on a campus, or some other program that does not require direct affiliation with the movement. Chabad has an absolutely massive online presence, a presence that is not commensurate to its numerical rankings. It regularly dominates searches regarding Jewish themes. Of the 50 searches I performed with a search engine and AI capable of citing its sources, every single search or prompt yielded a Chabad entry within the top 5 titles listed. Every single search. Best I could establish, since 1988, Chabad has amassed some 2,400 online audio classes and almost 10,000 pages of information. This is independent of contributions made by ideologically sympathetic individuals, such as Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Jacobson's the Yeshiva.net and the infamous Rabbi David Aaron, no, not me, but a mystic who lives in Jerusalem, who has his own personal material not sponsored by Chabad Central. Anyone could have presented a similar statistical analysis prior to the popularization of large language models without talking about Canon. You may remember that Professor Stephen Kaufman talked about such errors about a decade ago standing in this very place. Moreover, many will see nothing alarming with this information and the apparent domination of a narrow array of Jewish ideologies on the web, just as they see nothing problematic with canon formation in general. I accept all of that. I am not one of those people, and I am suggesting that the development of an ethics of reading as a central component over every curriculum, from grammar school to rabbinic school, is absolutely fundamental for sustaining critical thinking into the future. Large language models are producing clusters of materials that are and will continue to serve as canons. These are emergent, unintended bodies of information. Just as authorities within a community sought and succeeded in controlling the flow of information by sanctioning the copying of some books and not others, today we are seeing an emergent canon that is resulting from the statistical significance of some voices on the web while others are barely heard. This process of information management is resulting in the amplification of select ideological perspectives. In effect, this is the unintended consequence parallel to the ancient practice of canonization. That is, this is emergent canonization in the contemporary world of optimized search engines and artificial intelligence. We need to educate as to what canons were devised to accomplish. Then we need to nurture a robust hermeneutics of suspicion. These are the first steps in creating an ethics of reading. Then what we need to do is educate regarding what LLMs and search engines actually do. There are certain things they do superbly without raising concerns. There are other things they do that require sophisticated critical evaluation. The Jewish canon online is de facto the Chabad canon, which currently crushes any other Jewish internet canon information. Please do not interpret my comments as negativity toward Chabad. I am a believer in the proliferation of ideas, and whoever finds joy and meaning in the life, philosophy, and practices espoused by a particular religious community, so sein miklik, they should live happily and healthily. On the other hand, I am deeply disturbed by the moral insensitivity of any religious community that explains away or ignores altogether repugnant elements in our religious canon without recognizing how those very ideas, contribute to the moral insensitivity of their adherents. The truth is, no single movement has taken up the challenge of producing an ethics of reading. And in a world of optimized search engines and omniscient-sounding artificial intelligence, this has major implications for the future development of Jewish learning in this institution and beyond.